Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second out of 3 webinars in the 2021 EPN COVID-19 webinar series. We are excited today to talk about common COVID vaccine misconceptions among caregivers, and we are pleased to have Dr. Nadine Riddick along with me as presenters. So welcome. I'd like to introduce or reintroduce Ms. Dawn Seek to all of you. She is the Executive Director of the Maryland National Capital Home Care Association and our fearless leader, and a woman who I deeply respect and admire. She is the brainchild and overall leader of this entire process. And so thank you, Dawn, for your support and your vision behind the webinar series and all of the great things that MINCA is supporting. I'd also like to thank the Maryland Office of Preparedness and Response. It's part of the Department of Health. They are the funders and supporters of this series. They can be reached just by reaching out to the Department of Health. EPN, the Emergency Preparedness Network, which is the home and the host of the webinar series, can be found at the website on your screen. MINCA, again, Maryland and DC's premier trade association for home care agencies of all stripes. If you are interested in joining MINCA, just reach out to minca.org. And if you need to reach me at Learn Care Together, I'm the founder, just reach me at hello@learncaretogether.com. So we have some upcoming webinars that we're excited about. On May 27th, we're having Heather Saunders, who's going to talk about the impact of infection prevention and control. Like, we're going to look at the impact of the COVID vaccine. So all of you have put in place a host of new measures and efforts to address infection prevention during the COVID pandemic. Now that more and more of your clients and caregivers are vaccinated, what is the impact on how you should approach infection prevention and control in home care? Heather will tell you what to do May 27th at 4 p.m. And we are going to have a series of workshops on how to increase caregiver vaccine confidence. So this is going to be a deep dive into the type of content that we covered in the first webinar and that we'll be covering today. If you want to identify people within your teams that are trusted by the caregivers on your teams, you can send them to this deep dive workshop where we will train them in techniques and strategies they can use to increase caregiver vaccine confidence within your home care agencies. All of these events can be found on the Emergency Preparedness Network website. That's mdemergencyprepnetwork.org under the events tab. So today I'm really excited to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Nadine Riddick. She is a virologist. That means a scientist who basically dedicates their time to studying viruses. She got her PhD from UPenn. She's previously worked at the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation. But what her special sauce, her special gift, is the ability for making science more easily understood by non-scientists. So she works as a content developer with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute Biointeractive Program, where she translates science in a way that can be understood. And so Dr. Riddick has really created a career that's focused on making science available to the public. And so she's bringing that skill to help unpack some of the science behind the COVID vaccine that can debunk many of the myths that are out there about the COVID vaccine. I never know who's there and who's heard this spiel before, so I'll do it very quickly. I'm Dr. Charlene Brown. I'm the curator, a moderator, and speaker for many of the webinars that we participated in this year and last. I'm the founder of Learn Care Together. We're a public health consulting firm, and recently we've been working with home care agencies on increasing caregiver vaccine confidence. I'm also the founder of an online ed tech company that's focused on online clinical simulations for nursing assistants. But most of my career before I became an entrepreneur was responding to global pandemics like the one that we're in now. I was the former deputy health commissioner in Baltimore. I worked at the FDA and USAID, and I've done a lot of media. So thank you so much for joining Dr. Riddick and myself. So we're gonna actually pause now and switch over to Dr. Riddick. I'm excited to see what she has to say.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for that great introduction, Dr. Brown. I am going to pull up my slides in one moment. All right, can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay,
Floor
perfect.
is yours.
All right, thank you, thank you. So good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here today. And as Dr. Brown mentioned, I'll be addressing some common misconceptions that people have with regard to the COVID-19 vaccines. And I'm going to jump right in. So the first misconception that we hear sometimes is that people are afraid that the vaccine is actually going to give them COVID. So the misconception being that I'm going to get COVID from taking the vaccine. And I just want to take a step back before we actually address that question kind of head on. So just to kind of clarify some terms. So when we're talking about COVID, so COVID-19, it is the disease that we hear about all the time in the news right now. And that disease is caused by a coronavirus. There's different types of coronaviruses. The one that's responsible for this particular disease is called SARS-CoV-2. But for the sake of our presentation today, we're just going to refer to it as the COVID virus. So that's just a little bit of background information on the virus that we're talking about. And then again, so the misconception is that the vaccine is going to give you the disease. And this is really just going a little bit into what do vaccines do. So all of the COVID vaccines have the same goal. And that goal really is to train our immune systems to recognize the COVID virus if we were ever to encounter it without us actually getting sick. So we're going to train our immune systems typically with a piece of that virus so that if we ever encounter the real thing, we're ready to kind of attack it. So again, how vaccines work. And vaccines are amazing. So they're basically imitating a form of the virus or bacteria, a virus in this case, with again, a piece of that virus. And we'll talk more about that. So we're putting that into our body. Once that's in our body, it basically sounds the alarm. So our bodies are amazing in the sense that they recognize what should be there and what should not be there. And this portion of the vaccine that's put in us should not be there. So it's going to alert our immune system, which basically is training it to develop different tools so that it can actually fight that virus. So if we ever were to encounter the real virus, in this case, if we were ever to encounter the COVID virus, we already have the tools, we have an immune system that is trained to recognize it and to respond really quickly. Okay, so to address our misconception, no. So the COVID-19 vaccine cannot give you COVID-19, and we'll stay there for a little bit, and we'll talk about that. So in the past, some vaccines were created from a weakened version of that particular virus that it was made to protect you from. But these COVID vaccines are actually a new type of vaccine that don't contain virus at all. So what these vaccines contain are instructions. And these instructions come in a form of mRNA or messenger RNA, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, or DNA. So again, these vaccines that are out here now, they don't contain the virus, they contain instructions. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine contain virus mRNA. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine contains virus DNA. So again, the mRNA or the DNA that they're giving us when we receive this vaccine, it's actually a partial instruction. So these vaccines don't contain a virus, and they don't even contain the complete instruction to make a virus. They just contain a piece of it. So the key takeaways from this point is that all of the COVID-19 vaccines, they contain information. They don't contain a virus. They contain information that can instruct our bodies to actually make a piece of the COVID virus so that our immune systems can then be activated. One thing that I will point out, so sometimes people say, you know, I got a vaccine and then I got sick. Again, these vaccines can't give you COVID because they don't contain the virus, but you may feel a little ill. So you may feel tired, you may have muscle aches, you may have a headache or fever. These are actually really good signs. So these are signs that your immune system is working and that it's actually doing that training. It's starting to develop those tools so that it can fight this virus if you ever saw it in the future. So the bottom line for this misconception is that the vaccine cannot give you COVID, again, because there's no virus in it. And it's really just giving you information to make a portion of the virus. All right. So moving on. So our next misconception is that the COVID vaccine will in some way mess with or change or alter my DNA. So that's a major concern that some people have. And again, so the kind of answer to this straight away is that it will not, but we'll take a step back and kind of talk about why this is. So first, we're going to look specifically at the Pfizer and Moderna COVID vaccines. And we mentioned that these vaccines contain that mRNA or messenger RNA. So mRNA or messenger RNA, that basically is a message that is from your DNA. So if we think about our bodies are made of cells. This image here is representing one cell. So our bodies are made of millions and millions of cells. A cell is kind of the smallest unit of a living thing. And our cells have lots and lots of things in them. But the only thing we're going to really focus on here is this section that hopefully you can see my cursor, this kind of pink circle in the middle. And this section represents an area in the cell that's called the nucleus. And what we'll say is the DNA. So DNA is basically our genes are made of DNA. All of our genes, all of our DNA, they live in this nucleus. They always stay there. The nucleus protects them. There are some things that can go in and out of the nucleus, but the DNA stays there. So again, it's kind of protected in that area. So when we think about the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, again, we mentioned that they are mRNA. And that mRNA is basically a message it's a message from the DNA to make a protein. So we'll stop there for one moment, and we're just gonna take a step back. So one thing that I want to mention, so basically these vaccines are taking advantage of our cells in a way that there's certain things that our cells do all the time. So making proteins is something that our cells are constantly doing. And when we think about proteins, you can think about there's proteins in our hair, there's proteins in our skin, there's proteins, we're made of proteins. So our bodies are constantly making these proteins, and it's through a process that's shown right here. And don't worry about transcription or translation. Don't worry about any of these words. The concept that I really want to get across is that our genes exist in DNA. So that's basically the instruction to make a protein. However, we can't go straight from DNA to protein. So there's a middleman involved, and that's the RNA. So that's that messenger RNA that we just talked about. So again, our cells are doing this all the time. If you put DNA or RNA in our cells, depending on what we're given, the whole goal is to make that protein. So with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, if we receive mRNA from COVID, we essentially receive the mRNA, and that is able to make a protein. So if we kind of come back to our image here, so we're saying that, so down here, we have our COVID mRNA. It's going to enter our cell, right? So this vaccine gave us COVID mRNA, it enters our cell, but as you can see, it's staying in this outer region. So it's not making its way to the nucleus, it's actually hanging out here. And it hangs out here because remember, the RNA is to make the protein, and all the ingredients to make the protein exist in this part of the cell. So mRNA from the vaccine, it does enter our cells. It stays in this region of the cell out here because all the ingredients it needs to make that protein are out here. So from there, we make that protein. In this case, the protein that these vaccines make, it's called the spike protein. So if you envision the coronavirus, there are all those little spikes on the outside. It's essentially creating that protein. So again, not the full virus at all, just that one protein. And then once that protein is available, our immune systems recognize it. It kind of sounds the alarm because it knows that that shouldn't be there. And then it's going to turn on the immune system to start kind of training and developing tools to fight the virus. So again, the vaccine just mimicking if we were to get infected so that we can train our immune system without actually getting sick. So the answer to this question, so the question being, will this vaccine interfere or somehow alter my DNA? For Pfizer and Moderna, it won't, and it's kind of just based on physical location. So we mentioned that the DNA exists here in the nucleus of the cell. The mRNA from the vaccine does enter our cell, but it stays out here because that's actually where it's making these proteins. So the mRNA actually never enters the nucleus, so it's never even near your DNA. Okay, so for Johnson and Johnson, the answer is the same, but it's slightly different. So for Johnson and Johnson, we mentioned that for this vaccine, what the vaccine is giving us is DNA. And it's actually using a virus. So it's using a virus that's not a coronavirus, but it's using a modified virus to put that DNA into our cells. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But essentially, we have this DNA here. And imagine this DNA represents the gene, right? The gene for that spike protein. So if we give a cell the gene for that spike protein, that DNA is actually going to go to the nucleus, right? We just talked about that. So DNA is in the nucleus. If we give DNA, that DNA will travel to the nucleus, but we're going to come back to our system that we've talked about that our cells are doing all the time. So remember, Johnson & Johnson is giving us DNA. That DNA starts here. It's the instructions for our gene. We want to make a protein, but we have to go through the mRNA step. So they're basically giving us one step back. So they give us the DNA, it goes to our nucleus. One thing that I'll say is if we look at this cell, our genes are in the form of DNA, and they're in this nucleus, and you can imagine them as like strings. So there are all these different strings that have our genes on them. When this piece of COVID DNA comes in, it does not break or it doesn't break or alter our string of DNA in any way. So the reason that the COVID DNA is going to the nucleus, and again, we're going to think back in terms of ingredients. So the DNA wants to make RNA because it wants to make a protein. The ingredients to make the RNA is in the nucleus. So again, the COVID DNA goes to the nucleus. All the ingredients to make the RNA is there. So we can make this RNA. And now that RNA will leave the nucleus, go out here where we had talked about earlier, and that's where the ingredients are to make the protein. So again, so the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a little bit different in the sense that it is giving us the DNA. That DNA does travel to the nucleus so that it can make the RNA. That RNA goes to this part of the cell where it makes proteins. But again, like we mentioned, the DNA from the vaccine, it does not break our strings of DNA. It doesn't interact with them. Okay. So the key takeaways from this point is that the Pfizer Moderna vaccines contain mRNA, and they're not even physically near the DNA, so they're not going to alter our DNA. And although the Johnson & Johnson vaccine contains DNA, and it does make its way to the nucleus, again, as we said, it's not going to break our strings of DNA. It's there for the sole purpose to make mRNA so that it can make the protein, which is what the vaccine wants to do. So bottom line, COVID-19 vaccines don't change or alter the DNA that's in the cells. All right, so we'll keep moving along. So misconception number 3 is that somehow the COVID vaccine contains a microchip or contains some type of tracking device that will allow the government to track me. So we're gonna talk about this a little indirectly, but I mean, what I can say is there are not. So there are not any tracking devices that are in these vaccines that will allow anybody to track you. But what we can do is look a little closer at what actually is in these vaccines. So first, we'll look at the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. Again, remember, these are our mRNA vaccines. And this image that I have over here, you can see the kind of lines. Those are the mRNA, like we've just talked about on the previous slide. And that's kind of the active ingredient. So if you think about the thing that we want is that mRNA, and we've just talked about it, we want it because it makes that spike protein. Now our body can see that. Our immune system can get alerted, and we're going to start making a response against it so we can protect ourselves. So mRNA is definitely there. And then there are some other things. So lipids is a type of fat. And as you can see in this picture over here, so basically the mRNA is kind of inside of this fat bubble. So you can see that these lipids make this bubble. The mRNA is inside, and it really is a way to help the vaccine. So this together, this is the vaccine. It helps it to enter our cells. And then there are some other things involved as well, such as salts, sugars, acids, stabilizers. And these things are really to kind of help maintain the vaccine shape. So again, this being what the vaccine looks like. You may have heard in the news, so RNA actually breaks down pretty quickly. So these things also help to kind of stabilize it. So it has to be frozen at pretty cold temperatures. So a lot of these other ingredients are really helping with that process. So either stabilizing the vaccine, kind of maintaining its quality, kind of protecting it when it is going through that freezing process. So these are the list of ingredients that are in the vaccine for Pfizer and Moderna. And if we look at Johnson & Johnson, again, the main things we've already talked about. So there's a virus. That virus, like we said, is what's kind of being used. So for the other vaccine, those fat bubbles were what's kind of being used to allow the mRNA into the cell. For the case of Johnson & Johnson, it's this virus that's allowing or bringing the DNA into the cell. And then that DNA is there. And like the other vaccines, there's salts, sugars, acids, again, just things that are going to help stabilize the vaccine and make it safe for storage. But one thing that is not in the vaccine is any type of tracking device. So if you are interested in learning more about the ingredients, they are publicly available. All of the ingredients are safe. And one thing that we know that's not there is a microchip or any kind of tracking device. And honestly, if the government wanted to track you, there's easier ways. So just social media data, cell phone GPS systems, social security numbers, there's much easier ways. So I definitely wouldn't be concerned that the vaccine is a mechanism or some way that the government is tracking you. And then this final misconception that I'm going to address before Dr. Brown continues to discuss others is this one here. So this is kind of comparing vaccines. And this is really looking at, so Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are better than Johnson & Johnson vaccine because they prevent more people from getting sick. And you may have seen in the news, there are lots of numbers that are being thrown out, lots of different percentages. So we're not going to go into the weeds about what that is, but just to kind of address how do we even know if a vaccine worked? So these are some numbers that you may be familiar with. So in the news, they've talked about Pfizer and Moderna. They have these efficacy rates of about 95%, and Johnson & Johnson has 66%. And some people think, Johnson & Johnson is worse because that number is lower. But what I will say is that, so vaccine efficacy, and again, we're not going to go into the details, but what it is telling us is the percent reduction of a disease in a group of people who got the vaccine that were part of a trial. So I know that's kind of a mouthful to think about, but it's really giving us an idea in that study. And again, that study, that research is being done with a vaccine group compared to a group that didn't get the vaccine or got a placebo. So it's difficult to compare these numbers to each other because they were all part of different studies. They occurred in different geographic locations. They also occurred at different points in the pandemic when there was different amounts of virus around. So there are lots of reasons why it's very tricky to try to compare these numbers. But what we can do is try to figure out, how do we know if this vaccine worked? So the goals for all of the COVID vaccines was really if people do get COVID, how can we, is there something we can do that they get less sick? Is there a way to reduce hospitalizations? And is there a way to reduce COVID-related deaths? So if we look at these numbers here, and again, these are the numbers that we were just looking at. So looking at the efficacies just against COVID in general, but there's other numbers that are important. So what we're looking at in this column here is the efficacy numbers in preventing severe COVID. So remember, COVID disease, there's people that go from asymptomatic, so no symptoms at all, to severe disease. So there's this whole spectrum. And what all of these vaccines do really well is they do a great job at preventing severe COVID. So if we look at Moderna, so this is thinking about the people that were in the Moderna clinical trial. the group that got the vaccine, and a very small number of people got infected. But if we consider those who did get infected, none of them experienced severe COVID. And you can see for Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, very low numbers of those people experienced severe COVID as well. So from that, this kind of tells us these vaccines do a good job that even if someone does get COVID, it does a great job at reducing the severity of their symptoms as a result of COVID. Another thing the vaccines do really well is preventing deaths. So deaths related to COVID. So again, if we think about the people in these trials, we're thinking about the people that got the vaccines and still got COVID. And again, that's a very small group of people. But of those people, none of them died from COVID, and none of them were even hospitalized. So kind of the bottom line here is that all three vaccines have been shown to keep people from developing severe COVID, keep people with COVID out of the hospital, and keep people alive. So just kind of bottom line, all three of these vaccines work very well. And from here, I'm actually going to transition back to Dr. Brown, who's going to address a few more misconceptions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Riddick. That was fantastic. Your enthusiasm about viruses and vaccines is contagious. And so thank you. Now we're going to get into some of the other misconceptions that are out there. There's a lot of people, caregivers, non-caregivers, everybody, they're suspicious because they're wondering how the vaccines were created so quickly. Well, there are a bunch of reasons that we're going to go through. First of all, a lot of money was spent by the government, by other governments, by foundations. US federal government, as of December, looking specifically at vaccine development and manufacturing, the US government put in $12 billion to support vaccine development. The Gates Foundation put in 2 or 3 billion. And many governments around the world have invested millions of dollars. That's dollars, billions of dollars. That's dollars going directly to pharmaceutical companies to support the development and manufacturing of the vaccine. So that hasn't happened before. Second, research was done a lot faster, like a lot faster. So if we look at how vaccine development usually occurs, we have a period of animal trials where we're making sure the vaccine is safe. Then we move into nice, human safety trials. Then we move into some early clinical trials with more people. And then we go into the big phase 3 clinical trial that tells you yes or no, that we see some impact of this vaccine or this drug or whatever the product is. When I worked at the FDA, this type of process takes years and years and years. Finally, after years of research, then your vaccine gets approved. What we did here was speed it up in a way I've never seen before. So we had animal studies, but these vaccines were put in people before the animal studies were finished. Everything overlapped. The studies happened at the same time. So before the phase 1 safety studies were done in people, we were already starting the phase 2 studies. Before the phase 2 studies were done, we're combining phase 2 and phase 3, and then took all that data to bring it to the FDA to get emergency use authorization in less than 2 years. So it was a very different process. But one of the things that made it so different was the incredible amount of overlap in the trials, which is not traditionally how research is done. The virus is everywhere. So you have so much coronavirus in society. If you're testing a vaccine, you need to wait for people in your clinical trial to become exposed to the thing you're vaccinating them against. So if it's mumps, you have to wait for people to actually, who've been vaccinated and people who've gotten your placebo, to bump into the mumps virus. Well, with COVID, they didn't have to wait long to bump into, it's everywhere. So we didn't have to add all those years of time when you're waiting to have your clinical trial participants bump into the virus that you're vaccinating them against. It was everywhere. It is everywhere. Finally, I don't know how many of you remember the SARS pandemic in the early 2000s or the MERS pandemic more recently in the Middle East. These are both pandemics that happened with a virus that was very similar to the virus that is behind the current COVID-19 pandemic. So they're all SARS viruses. And so way back in 2002, there was vaccine research. Nobody knew that this pandemic would only last a couple of years. And so vaccine research began back then. Then there was more vaccine research later on because of MERS. There was a whole separate group of people, actually one very determined woman in many cases, really studying how we could use mRNA in vaccines. So you had all of this research that predated the pandemic that helped to inform the development of this vaccine and helped to speed things up. So it wasn't that research began, the very first research for this virus began at the start of the pandemic. There was lots of older research that could be leveraged to inform how we would approach vaccine development. Finally, mRNA, which Dr. Riddick spent some time telling us about, the virus mRNA, it can be made in the lab like really fast, which is great. It's much, much faster than traditional methods of creating a vaccine. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are mRNA vaccines, and they can just be made quickly. It's part of why they were able to be to finish their vaccine development, their trials, and become the first to be approved in the US. Another misconception is that there's a larger conspiracy where we're experimenting on people. So the experiments already happened. And I've talked to, this actually really helped when I was talking to some caregivers who were talking about this idea of experimentation, to highlight that the experiments already happened. Last year, Pfizer, Moderna, JNJ clinical trials, and other trials that are ongoing, there are people who signed up voluntarily to be the guinea pigs in those experiments, to be the ones to get the vaccine even before they were finished with animal safety trials. So those are the people who were experimented on. Now, once a vaccine has gotten emergency use authorization from the FDA and it is now available to the public and the population, that means that instead of 55,000 people across 3 sets of trials receiving a vaccine, you have millions. At this point, we're up to over 1 billion people have been vaccinated worldwide. So now this is when you see the kinds of side effects that cannot be found in clinical trials, that don't show up because you don't have enough people who've been vaccinated. So we've all heard in the news about the Johnson & Johnson side effect with cerebral venous sinus thrombosis and thrombocytopenia. That is extremely rare. It's not something that the studies are powered to find. So whether it's a drug or a vaccine, there's always going to be what some people might perceive as experimentation when that approved item is released to the public, because the rare side effects can only be found once a much larger number of people have been exposed to it, much larger than you will ever be able to do in a clinical trial. Now, this idea of experimentation is actually rational, right? It's rational whether you're talking to people from this country, people from other countries. There's a long history of unethical research studies, and so it's fair. So one of the key messages is that when the caregiving professionals in your teams are worried about whether or not people are experimenting on them, don't be dismissive and recognize that their fear is founded, and you can just help them to understand that the bulk of the experiments have already happened. There's a lot of worry about fertility, especially among caregivers of reproductive age. There's no evidence that the vaccine can impact your fertility. One thing that the caregivers I worked with found really helpful was understanding that even in the experiments, even in the clinical trials, there were people who, nobody was allowed to be in the trial if they were pregnant at the time they enrolled, but many people became pregnant during the trials and they had successful pregnancies. The CDC recommends the vaccine in pregnancy. They recommend the vaccine if you're trying to get pregnant. There have been no unexpected pregnancy outcomes. And just last week, there was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine that did a deep dive looking at data on 35,000 pregnant people who were given the vaccine during pregnancy over a 2-month period. And there was really no difference in concerning pregnancy outcomes, things like stillbirths or small birth weight. There was no difference between the people who completed their pregnancies during that time that they were looking at it in the study and the general population. So again, will you be able to have children? There's no reason to think you won't unless there's something else preventing it. And the vaccine is believed to be safe in pregnancy. So this is one of many, many conspiracy theories about depopulation and the vaccine being a part of a plan to wipe out the Black race. So no, that's not what's happening. But that fear, that belief system is rooted again in this long history of unethical trials. And these are not historical trials. People like to talk about Tuskegee. That was a long time ago. We have trials very recently that pretty significantly unethical. You combine that with the population and reproductive health efforts we've supported around the globe. We spend hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to make birth control accessible in low and middle income countries around the world. That birth control is usually given through an injection, a Depo-Provera injection. So there is a history of people receiving injections that are meant to depopulate them. That's through the lens of someone who's seeing that effort as an attempt to keep them from having children. So you have all of this history of injections, trying to address population control, unethical trials, lots of disinformation spreading from home countries for many caregivers who are immigrants. And the skepticism around the vaccine is based on fundamental mistrust. So the truth is there is not a depopulation plan to wipe out the Black race or any race, but having a respect and understanding of that fear and that concern and recognizing it's actually grounded in real experience can help to begin a conversation where you're able to highlight why that's not the case. So let's stop here. And I'm going to take a minute and thank Dr. Riddick and invite my hero, Dawn Seek, to join us. Sarah, if you could unmute Dawn Seek. And I'd like her to say a few words. Dawn, if you remember, is Executive Director of the Maryland National Capital Home Care Association. I just want to give her a chance to say hello.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
We can. Welcome, Dawn.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending this event today. I want to put out a special thank you to Dr. Brown and Dr. Riddick for this information. It's extremely important, and I'm just very glad that we can offer this to all of you in home care. And I really want to encourage you to share this information with your colleagues and your staff. Our goal is to have the home care workers make their decisions based on fact, not fiction. And this information, I believe, will really help us help them make a good decision for themselves. I also want to thank the Maryland Office of Preparedness and Response for their funding that allows us to bring these events to you, and also to the Emergency Preparedness Network staff, because they work very hard behind the scenes to make sure that this information is posted, that it gets out. So thank you to them as well. Last but not least, I encourage you, if you have not already become a member of the Emergency Preparedness Network, to please go to the website. I did put the website link in the chat box. It is free, and there is an enormous amount of emergency preparedness information there, and it's all free for you to download and use. You can also brand it with your own logos. But most important right now, we just posted 3 very important handouts that speak to the COVID-19 vaccination situation. And those were handouts that were actually created by Dr. Brown. So thank you very much for that. And lastly, if you are not a member of the Maryland National Capital Home Care Association, I urge you to go to the website, and I will put that in the chat box as well, and take a look. We are a home care association that exists for you and because of you, and we do need your support. And there are many benefits to membership that you only see when you become a member. But if anybody's interested in learning more, please feel free to reach out to me directly. And again, I'll put my information in the chat box. And once again, thank you very much for being with us today. And thank you very much to our presenters for this very important information.
Thank you so much, Dawn. That's wonderful. So the take-home message, join EPN, join Minka, become part of this beautiful network that we know and love. And with that, we'd like to open the floor to questions. I see we have a question from Bev Francis. Yes, the presentation is being recorded, and that recording will be posted on the EPN website. So that's mdemergencyprepnetwork.org, and you'll receive a notification when it's available to be watched again. So thanks for that question, Bev. Also, Bev, some of the content that we covered today is covered in one of the fact sheets that Dawn mentioned that you can find on the EPN website as well. And we're also going to do a much deeper dive with a lot more hand-holding about how you can talk to your caregiving professionals about these and other myths, and how you can begin to build the trust with your teams to increase their confidence in the vaccine and help to keep them and the clients that you care for safe. So do we have any other questions, thoughts, feedback, insights, stories about myths that you've been hearing from your staff that you'd like to share? We are all ears, and we are available. Wow, so does this mean that none of the people in your organizations are vaccine hesitant? They're all like racing to get vaccinated with no misconceptions? Okay, well, in that case, we have a part of the presentation. Oh, wait, never mind. I'm sorry I joined late. Can you address the fetal tissue concern for all 3 vaccines? Got it. So thank you, Alzheimer's Association. There's been a lot of concern that there's an impact on our placenta, so that the vaccines are similar enough to this protein in our placenta that when we generate antibodies in response to the vaccine, that it will attack the placenta and affect pregnancies. That has been shown not to be the case. While there are some similarities between the spike protein in the coronavirus and the proteins in our placenta, they are not the same. The antibodies do not interact with the placenta. There's no risk to fetal tissue. Maybe I hope I'm answering the right question. So I'm thinking about placenta tissue and the concern that the immune response the vaccines generate in us leads to an attack on the placenta during pregnancy. If that was not your question, if you were thinking about another thing, please clarify.
And I can kind of speak to like another aspect of that, that might be what they were talking about as well. I'm not sure. But I know there are some concerns about the vaccine being developed using cell lines that were derived from fetal tissue. And what I can say is for Pfizer and Moderna, so the 2 mRNA vaccines, in the lab, when they're actually making the mRNA, like Dr. Brown kind of described, it's this process that's relatively quickly. So kind of in like doing the basic research or in the lab, those cell lines have been used, but in the production of those vaccines, those cell lines are not used. When it comes to Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, which isn't authorized in the US, but is in the UK, but it's very similar to Johnson & Johnson. Those cell lines have been used in both the kind of development as well as the production. So there are some different groups that have kind of talked about the ethics around that. But yeah, what I can say is that the Moderna and Pfizer, those cell lines are not used in the production of those vaccines, although they are used in the production of Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca.
Great answer, Dr. Riddick. And we got another note from the Alzheimer's Association saying they were actually asking about the creation of the vaccines, and you addressed that question. Yeah, apparently the Alzheimer's Association has had some individuals that were concerned about the use of fetal tissue in the development or manufacture of vaccines. Wonderful. That was a great question. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? If not, we have a part of the presentation that we cut off just in case there were questions. So I'm going to actually invite Dr. Riddick to share her screen and talk about some of the religious messages that have been anti-vaccine and some of the concerns around religion and COVID vaccine.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. Any questions that you have? So there's not much to this part of the presentation, but any questions that you have, I am happy to address. And thank you for the question that we just received from the Alzheimer's Association. So this is kind of just thinking in terms of just faith-based concerns regarding the vaccines. And what I can say is a number of faith groups have released statements supporting the COVID vaccines. And I just kind of made that distinction between, what vaccines were tested in cell lines that were derived from fetal cell lines. And again, these are basically, the cell lines are cells that basically just keep on dividing. So our cells, we've talked about cells earlier in the presentation, our cells can only divide to a certain point, then they're going to stop and they're going to die. In the lab, there are cell lines, a lot of them are cancerous, but there are these different cell lines that have been created that can kind of divide forever. And that's really beneficial in the lab because you're doing this continuous research. So some concern that individuals have is that some of these cell lines were derived from fetal tissue from decades ago. But a number of faith-based organizations have, there's different articles, and I'm happy to share them with Dr. Brown, and she can make them available to you all, but various faith organizations and individuals have spoken up or have talked about this and kind of addressed it. And there are a number of groups that have released statements supporting the use of COVID vaccines. Even Johnson & Johnson, which I mentioned, is produced in these cell lines, such as the organizations listed here. And then just thinking about, in general, a lot of the message that's coming from a number of these faith groups is this idea of loving your neighbor. So in the sense of like getting vaccinated doesn't just protect you. So we've talked a lot about, and you can talk to your caregivers about, the vaccine does protect you from getting severe COVID. But the way, and we've seen this over the past year, COVID, even if I'm asymptomatic, I might carry COVID or the COVID virus and pass that on to someone who would develop severe symptoms. So again, it's really thinking about, yes, protecting you to some degree, which is great, but also protecting your community. So kind of thinking about that message in general. And again, if there's any questions about faith-based concerns, I'm happy to try to address them and definitely share some material with Dr. Brown. That was it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Riddick. So I have a very high index of suspicion that some of you have heard faith-based arguments against vaccination. If you have, we'd love to hear about them or address any other questions that you may have about misconceptions that we didn't cover in this presentation, but that are definitely circulating out there. There's so many more than we could possibly cover in an hour webinar. On the Maryland Emergency Preparedness Network website, down in the resources section, the link to the 3 resources pages don't seem to be live yet. We will look into that. I thought they were. Let's see. So I'm going to ask Dawn or Sarah to just look into this question about whether or not the fact sheets are available on the website, and then we can answer Rebecca in a few minutes. But if you guys could look into that, that would be great. We have another question. I've heard concerns surrounding the efficacy of J&J, individuals considering obtaining an additional vaccination, Moderna or Pfizer. So people who've gotten the J&J vaccine considering another vaccination, that is not recommended. Dr. Riddick, why don't you, since you talked about efficacy, why don't you tackle that and then I can add on.
Okay. Sure. So one, I would say, and Dr. Brown already mentioned this, so definitely there's articles that talk about kind of like mix matching the vaccines is not recommended. So again, the information that we have, all the safety data that we have from these clinical trials are specific to Pfizer or Moderna or Johnson & Johnson, but that would be a true experiment. So there's no kind of mix and matching, and we don't know what that would do. So definitely, the recommendation is not to get, at least at this point, there's no recommendation to further get vaccinated. One thing you may have heard in the news, even with Pfizer and Moderna, so they've talked about additional boosters to their vaccine. So they're kind of in the process of potentially developing additional vaccines to some of the newer variants. So you might have heard of the UK variant or the Brazil variant, the South Africa variant. So there are other variants or versions of the coronavirus that are circulating now that weren't present when those clinical trials were going on. So they weren't sure at first if their vaccines worked well against them. So again, so there are the pharmaceutical companies themselves may make a booster, and that would be fine to take. But I definitely don't see any recommendations where you got Johnson & Johnson and then you're considering another one. And like we did mention earlier in the presentation, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, although it does have a lower efficacy, there's some things to keep in mind. So Pfizer and Moderna were just done in the US. Johnson & Johnson was done in the US, South America, and South Africa. So it was a larger kind of geographic area. It also happened later in the pandemic when there was a lot more COVID going around. So like Dr. Brown mentioned earlier, these trials happen fast because there's so much COVID and people are getting infected. So just the likelihood of getting infected increased later when there was more COVID kind of going around compared to earlier in the pandemic when the Moderna and Pfizer clinical trials were happening. So there's kind of different reasons why that number could be lower. But again, the recommendation being kind of wait to see what they say. And I think if they wanted to create a booster, Johnson & Johnson would make a booster for their vaccine.
So what she said, I agree with every word. And we don't know if someone who's received one Johnson & Johnson vaccine and if they've mounted a robust immune response and then take another vaccine, we don't actually know if that might cause harm. So it has not been studied. It is not recommended. There you go. Oh, we have more. So Rebecca says, thank you, that route of accessing them does work. It's just that if you scroll down, oh, okay. So perfect. Okay, so Dawn has put a whole number of links in the chat that you can click to directly to get to the COVID-19 fact sheets. But there seems to be a problem with one part of the page on the resources tab. So if you'd like to get the fact sheets, just go ahead and click the links in the chat. Just click them right now before the webinar ends and they're no longer visible. And then you can download them at your convenience. But yes, we have, actually there's one main link, which is mdemergencyprepnetwork.org/COVID-19-fact-sheets. And have fun with them. Thank you so much for catching that they were hard to find, and now we know where to find them. And I'm sure that the technical team will dig into what the problem is with the resources tab. Okay, let's see. Any more questions? All right. Well, what I can say in closing is that this pandemic is unlike any other pandemic of any of our careers. It's fast moving, it's constantly evolving. I just read about yet another variant, another double mutation. It's actually many more than double, but like 2 scary mutations that has come out has been discovered in India. The more people can get vaccinated, the less this virus will have the freedom to roam and mutate and create variants that may or may not be responsive to our vaccination infrastructure. So please, thank you for joining us today. And we are thrilled about your enthusiasm about vaccination. There is one comment that says, thank you for this great info. I'll be sharing with connections around the country. Oh, wonderful. Yes, thank you. I'm just going to bring back up the slides to give you another chance to reach out to Minka, EPN, or me info@mdemergencyprepnetwork.org puts you in touch with EPN. Info@minca.org puts you in touch with Minca. hello@learncaretogether.com puts you in touch with our company. And thank you so much for attending. Another thank you for the Office of Preparedness and Response. And we are so pleased that you could join us today. Don't forget to get the fact sheets and sign up for the upcoming webinar May 27th and the workshop that does a deep dive on how to increase caregiver vaccine confidence on June 9th. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.